On this lesson, we continue adding drag and drop support for our application. On the previous lesson, we connected our native UI component to the drag and drop events from the OS. So now the time has come to take care of the JavaScript side of things. I just polished the UI a little bit because this is going to be the last lesson in the course, but nothing else should have changed. Great, so we can start emitting events via our React Native bridge. In order to achieve this, we need to modify our bridging code a little bit. I'm gonna go back into Xcode and I'm gonna create a new file, this time not on my lib folder, just directly on the root. It's gonna be a Swift file and it's gonna be called building apps emitter. I am just gonna take the code from the lesson and let's just walk over it. So I'm creating a class. I am going to create a shared instance. So this is the same pattern that you have seen before with the default instances of some of the macOS classes, right? I don't want you to create a bunch of emitters, or I don't want the application to create an emitter every time you need to dispatch an event. I'm just gonna give you a shared instance for you to do your operations. Then I'm gonna create a native emitter, which is going to be our native class. We're gonna modify it in a little bit, right? This is the actual object that can communicate with the JavaScript side of things. So I'm just creating a variable for it. My init function is gonna be empty. This is just gonna hold these references for me. Then I'm gonna create a register emitter function, because what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take already existing emitter, which is gonna be created by the React Native bridge, and I'm just gonna put it inside of my variable. I'm gonna have a dispatch function. This is the function that I'm gonna call whenever I want to send an event to the JavaScript side of things. It's gonna take a name, the name of the event, and a body, which is any payload, right? We want to be able to send generic payloads to the native side, to our JavaScript. So inside I'm gonna reach into my emitter and I'm gonna call the send event function. I'm gonna pass the name that I had before and the body. So right now this is unrecognized because we haven't modified our native class or native bridge class, but we will do it in a little bit. And here I'm just gonna create more specific functions, right? Just so I don't end up sending events which are not recognized by my system. Whenever I'm coding the native side, I want to have a little bit more type safety. So I'm just gonna create a function that is gonna dispatch the file dropped event. It only has the name hard-coded into it, and the body is generic as always. Great, so I'm gonna save that. Then I'm gonna start turning our bridge instance into an event emitter. In order to do this, first I'm gonna go into the bridge file, and there's one header file that I need to add to the compilation process. I need to import the RCT event emitter class, which is not there by default. I'm gonna save that, and I'm gonna go back to my building apps native file on the Objective-C side of things. And I'm gonna I'm gonna add the header file that I added into my bridge. Right, so not only I have the bridge module, but I have the event emitter module in there now. And I'm gonna change my definition of the extern module. So instead of extending a generic NSO object, now this is gonna extend the event emitter, right? So we're basically telling this Swift file that we used before, we're telling React Native that it no longer will hold simple functions that can be called, but it will actually turn itself into an event emitter. I'm gonna save that. And there's one more thing that we need to add into this file, which is we need to add an external method, and this needs to be called the supported events function, right? So React Native itself also needs to know which events can you subscribe to. If you try to subscribe to an event that is not there, then it will crash. So we need to return an array of the possible values, of the possible events that you can subscribe. So now I'm gonna go into the Swift file of things, into the Swift part. And I'm going to change, first of all, the base object that I'm extending. I'm going to change this into the RCT event emitter. Afterwards, I am going to modify some of these methods. So first, I'm gonna overwrite my init function. I'm gonna call the previous or the super parent, which now is the RCT event emitter init function. And I am going to call my emitter, the class that we created before, which will hold the reference for the specific emitter. I'm gonna reach into the shared instance, which should already be created for me, and I'm gonna register my emitter. And my emitter is gonna be this class itself, this instance that React Native is gonna create for me. Then I need to add the override extension to this function, because the RCT event emitter has already implemented this, so we're just gonna override it. And finally, I need to return my list of supported events. So once again, I need to override this, and I'm just gonna return an array of events that my JavaScript should be able to subscribe to. So this string needs to match our dispatch function, right? This is also useful for React Native. If I try to send an event that's not there, then this is not gonna work. Great. So in theory, if I would compile the app right now, it should compile just fine. And we see that it does. Let's just give it a little time. Okay, great. So right now, in theory, everything is set up. So now we just need to start listening for events on the JavaScript side of things. So I'm gonna go back into VS Code, and I'm gonna go into my Building Apps native TypeScript file. So here, now will be a bigger change. Unfortunately, some of the functionality of React Native is based on classes, and we're gonna have to modify this file a little bit to use a class. So first, I'm gonna start by modifying my imports, and I'm gonna import some extra classes. I'm gonna import my emitter subscription. I'm going to import the native event emitter. And afterwards, I'm gonna modify the main code. So I'm just gonna copy and paste it, and we'll walk over it just so I don't make any mistakes. So you see, not much changes except that we're using a class. But if you have a Kenai, you will realize that we now are extending the native emitter class. This is the class that actually can emit the events, and we need to extend it. We cannot just directly bind it, because otherwise React Native will send not only the event, but actually a bunch of metadata with the object, and that's gonna crash our application. So basically we subclass the native event emitter. Let me just delete this. This just got in there. And all my previous methods that I created, they're still there. They haven't changed. But by extending the native class, I should now have access to even more functionality. If I try to access here, you will see that I have this add listener method. This is the one that we're gonna use to register our listeners for specific events. So I'm just gonna leave it as is. And now I am going to go into my UI store, and we're gonna listen for file drops, and specifically for image file drops. So I'm just gonna get the image from the user, and I just want to display it in my UI. So I'm gonna create an image URL. It starts as null, but it can be a string. Next, I am going to go to the last part of my store, right? After my store has been iterated, this is where we created the code to persist our application. But this is basically the last thing that's gonna happen to my store before the UI is ready to be interacted with. So in here, I'm gonna call my native file, and I'm gonna add a listener. I'm gonna listen for the same event that I have been creating in Xcode all this time, right? Which is the file dropped. And I'm gonna pass a function, and this function is gonna receive a payload from the native side. In my payload, I'm gonna run an action, and I'm gonna tell on my store the image URL is going to be equal to my payload URL. If we go back to Xcode and let us quickly look into our into our status bar button extension, here we can see we're emitting from a shared instance a file dropped function, and the URL is going to contain the absolute string for our file. So now what I can do, I'm going to go into my books container, and I'm going to display this image to the user. So on the top of my view, I am going to create, first I'm going to check from my root, from my UI store, if there is a image URL in there. If there is an image URL, I want to display it to the user. So I'm going to use an image component, which is part of React Native. The image component takes a source prop. In the URI part of the source prop, I'm gonna pass my root.ui.imageURL. And then I am just going to give it a little bit of style. So we already been through this. I want this to be with full. I want it to have a height of, I don't know, 20. And we can save it. And now has come the moment of truth. If I have a very nice image of Gollum here, because that's one of my favorite books. And you can see whenever I hover, the button highlights itself. And if I drop it, there you go. Right? So let me just change this in order to be a little bit more visible. I'm gonna close my dev window. Still not very visible. Let me just add this to 64. I think that works. Great. Right, so this is how we now have drag and drop capabilities. I'm just going to create a random image. I drop it. Perfect, beautiful, right? So now we can do a lot of things. The code is not complete, so I cannot drag and drop from the web browser, but you have all the tools in there. If you want to drag and drop from a different application that has a different type of file and creates a different promise for you, you can do that. You can register for dragging and dropping URLs. You can register for dragging and dropping audio files. You can immediately play the audio file. It's amazing. It's amazing. You can do a lot of things. And